logging the precise angle of my approach and the time elapsed since my last logged presence. I am Lex Mechanic Senior Grade Ulverin Threx, assigned to Vault Helix Theta 9. Obscurus Segmentum Data Vault Complex, Sub-Level 14. I have processed data at this terminal for 16 years, 4 months, and 9 days. The Servo Skull knows this. The Servo Skull knows everything I do within these walls, and it reports everything I do to the Doctrinal Oversight Node, located at the terminus of Corridor 7, and the Doctrinal Oversight Node reports everything to the Administratum Subchamber above us, and the Administratum Subchamber reports everything to the greater body of the Administratum, which reaches across the Imperium in bureaucratic infinity, all the way to Terra itself, where the God Emperor sits in eternal vigil and protection over every logged entry, every file deviation, every notation and cataloging act performed by every Lex Mechanic at every terminal in every data vault ever built in his name. I performed the handshake protocol. The machine accepted my biometric signature. The alcove filled with the familiar amber glow of processing warmth. This is correctness. This is how a shift begins. The induction queue presented 23 data parcels awaiting classification, standard volume for a night cycle shift. I began with the first in sequence, a tithe projection update from a Manufactorum world in the outer Obscurus reach, and processed it in 11 minutes. The second was a mortality ledger from an Agri world, 19,000 dead from a combination of harvest equipment failure and weather cycle collapse, all properly notated in the subcategory of acceptable operational loss. The third was a compliance confirmation from an ecclesiarchy mission station confirming that all citizens within its jurisdiction had received their devotional hour quotas for the preceding standard year. I processed these without deviation. The Servo Skull watched me process them. I was watched processing them, and I processed them correctly, and this was good. The fourth item in the queue sat apart from the others. Not physically. The queue presents as a ranked list of text identifiers, glow traced against the amber of my terminal interface. The fourth item occupied its position in the list as any other item would. Its text identifier read, in the standard classification font, Dataset Counterfactual Origin Reference, Theta 9, Upsilon 7, Dark. The authorization glyph appended to its header was not one I recognized by personal familiarity, but it matched the standard pattern for top-tier Administratum clearance, and the machine liturgy had already processed and accepted the authorization before the queue had been presented to me. I noted the authorization tier, clearance beyond my own grade. I noted the dataset designation, which did not conform to standard tithe, census, or operational categories. I noted the subcategory tag, which read, Compliant Counterfactual Reconstruction. I opened it because it was in my queue, and my queue is my duty. The first thing I observed was that the dataset had no external authentication handshake logged. In standard processing, a dataset at this clearance level would bear a chain of authentication records, each stamp from a higher authority confirming the validity of the prior, going back through layers of sanctioned review until one reached the initiating source. This dataset had no such chain. It had no stamps at all beyond the single authorization glyph. It had validated itself. I remained still for 4 seconds, long enough to constitute a behavioral anomaly if the Servo Skull interpreted it as hesitation. I covered the pause by reaching for my notation rod and entering a brief procedural tick mark against the entry, a standard action that a senior Lex Mechanic might perform when noting an initial anomaly for potential escalation. The anomaly, I told myself, was most likely an artifact of the authorization tier. Datasets processed at the highest clearance levels sometimes travel through channels that do not generate logs accessible to my level. The absence of visible authentication was not necessarily absence of authentication. The Emperor's design encompasses processes invisible to those who serve within it. Faith in the system's correctness is itself a component of correct operation. I noted the anomaly. I logged it as a formatting irregularity pending review. I opened the dataset for processing. The first page of the reconstruction was a census file. Standard formatting in terms of visual presentation, column headers separating data fields, numerical population figures, coordinate references for systems and worlds, date stamps spanning centuries of documented habitation. Except that nothing in the column headers was familiar. There was no tithe compliance column, there was no Aquila designation field. There was no ecclesiarchy affiliation record. There was no compliance status indicator, no deviation flag column, no processing center assignment, no astropathic registry number. The populations were accounted for by number and by system location and by standard year of record, and nothing else. I looked at the first record in the census. A world designated by a string of alphanumeric characters in a cataloging system I did not recognize. Population: 412,000 souls. Standard year of record: M35, 207. Habitation status: stable. Resource extraction notes: none. Tithe assessment: none. Governing authority: regional council, non-affiliated. Non-affiliated with what? The record did not specify, because there was nothing to affiliate with. The column for governing imperial authority was absent, not blank, absent. I attempted to apply the standard formatting protocols. When a dataset arrives with incomplete column structure, the classification system provides a correction overlay that maps the present data to the nearest matching imperial schema, filling absent columns with default notation and flagging the adjustment for review. I initiated the correction overlay. The system ran the overlay. It ran the overlay for longer than usual, 17 seconds instead of the standard 2 to 4, and when it completed its work, it produced a notification I had not seen in 16 years of operation. The notification read, "Schema incompatibility. No applicable imperial reference structure identified. Manual classification required." I stared at this notification. I read it twice, the second reading taking longer because something in me was already constructing a response before I had fully processed the message. The machine was telling me that it could not map this data to imperial categories because no applicable imperial categories existed. Not because the data was corrupted or unusable, but because the data described a reality for which imperial organizational schema had no corresponding framework. I closed the notification window. I opened my personal notation log, which is itself a sanctioned document visible to oversight, and I entered the following: dataset theta 9, upsilon 7, dark present schema incompatibility. Initiating manual classification under Lex Mechanic grade authority per protocol 7 to 7 of the Vault Processing Charter, anomaly noted and logged. This was procedurally correct. Manual classification under grade authority is a recognized protocol. By entering the notation, I was performing exactly what a correctly functioning Lex Mechanic should perform when encountering a processing obstacle. I was not deviating, but I was also, without deciding to do so, telling the system that I would classify this data myself, that I would look at it, that I would continue. When I think back on it, which I sometimes do in a way I cannot fully characterize, that was the moment, not the moment I opened the dataset, not the moment I saw the missing columns. The moment I wrote that notation and chose to proceed rather than escalate to the overnight supervisor at Corridor 7 was the moment the thing became irreversible. I did not know that then. I know it now in the way I know other things about that night, which is to say not completely, but enough. The directive arrived 4 hours into my processing of the dataset. It came through the standard administrative relay channel, tagged to my terminal identification code, marked as priority continuation authorization. From a higher administratum node whose designation was a 7-character string, I did not have clearance to expand into a full institutional name. The directive text was brief. It read, Lex Mechanic Threx. Continuation of current assigned task is sanctioned. Process dataset without inquiry. Standard classification protocols suspended for this item. Proceed. I read this message several times. There is a phrase in that message that I want to discuss for a moment, though discussing it here serves no purpose beyond the ordering of what happened, which matters to me in the way that correct sequencing matters to any processor of data. The phrase is, without inquiry. The phrase does not mean what it superficially suggests, or rather it means exactly what it suggests, and this is what made it significant. A directive to process without inquiry is not unusual in the administratum. Much of what we process arrives sealed, its origins unknown to us, its purpose irrelevant to our function. We are the processing layer, not the comprehension layer. Understanding is not our role, continuity is our role. But this directive had been issued in response to nothing I had visibly done. I had not sent an inquiry. I had not flagged the dataset for review above my own level. I had entered a notation of schema incompatibility and had begun manual classification, both of which were permitted acts under my authority. I had asked no questions. The directive answered questions I had not asked, which meant that someone above me was watching my processing in real time and had anticipated that I would ask them, which meant they knew what I was about to encounter. I filed the directive in my notation log with a standard acknowledgement response, 7 words, received and compliance noted, thank you. I returned to the dataset. The planetary record I had been examining when the directive arrived was a world in what I calculated, based on coordinate references within the file, to be a region of space corresponding to the mid-obscurus zone, approximately 43 light-years from the nearest world I could cross-reference in my Vault's standard galactic map files. The world had been inhabited since M33, according to the dataset's records. It had maintained a stable population ranging between 300,000 and 500,000 souls across more than 2,000 years of documented existence. The population fluctuations corresponded to climate variation and modest resource competition, both of which the population had adapted to through what the records described as community-level resource management structures. I found this phrasing irregular, community-level resource management structures. In Imperial terminology, resource management at a planetary scale is handled through tithes assessed by the administratum and administered by a planetary governor, appointed or ratified by Imperial authority. There is no parallel structure for unaffiliated community management because unaffiliated communities are not permitted to manage themselves at scale. The assessment system exists precisely to ensure that no human population develops autonomous resource management practices that could lead to doctrinal deviation or independent political formation. This population had done exactly that for 2,000 years, and the records showed no evidence of deterioration, no evidence of ideological collapse, no mass starvation cycles, no evidence of xenos predation or warp incursion, no population-level trauma signatures, no medical catastrophe markers. The data was, in the taxonomic sense, clean. The population's primary health indicators were within ranges I recognized as functional, not thriving by any metric of imperial abundance, but stable. The kind of stability that, in imperial records, is almost never recorded for unaffiliated worlds because unaffiliated worlds do not produce records that reach imperial archives. They are either brought to compliance, which generates records of their integration, or they are consumed by whatever the void contains, which generates no records at all. I tried to locate the suffering index. This is not a standard column header in external datasets, but it is a concept embedded in nearly every form of imperial data collection because suffering, in the administratum's operational framework, serves as a primary indicator of correct governance. A population that suffers in sanctioned ways is a population that is being appropriately culled, tithe extracted, and spiritually maintained. Populations without measurable suffering are, by doctrine, populations that are either lying about their data or populations that are not being governed correctly. There was no suffering index. There was no equivalent metric. The records simply described what people ate and how many of them were alive and what they built and how long they lived, and those records showed a functional civilization proceeding without imperial presence. It did not register as hypothetical. I want to be precise about this because it is what distinguished that planetary record from any counterfactual I had processed in my career. Academic counterfactuals, which are produced by administrator modeling divisions for strategic planning purposes, are clearly labeled at every data level as projected, modeled, or hypothetical constructs. Their data cells carry ghost flags, visual indicators that distinguish them from historical record. The census file I was processing carried no ghost flags. Its data cells were formatted identically to historical record. The dataset called itself a reconstruction, but its internal structure was indistinguishable from archived historical truth. I filed the planetary analysis under the notation population record, schema non-standard, flagged for categorical review, stability anomaly noted. Anomaly was the word I used, because a human world existing in stable function without imperial governance is an anomaly. The word felt correct. It grounded the record in familiar categorical language. It made the observation manageable. I moved to the next section of the dataset. The warp activity logs were dense. They occupied the largest single block of data within the dataset, spanning what I calculated to be the equivalent of approximately 40 standard years of astropathic notation, reduced to a compressed statistical record covering multiple sectors and multiple centuries. Warp records in standard Imperial archives are among the most carefully secured and restricted materials within any data vault, accessed primarily by inquisitorial staff and astropathic core supervisors, and not by lex mechanics of my grade. I had processed fragments of warp records occasionally in the context of larger administrative packages where the warp data was a supporting document for transit corridor requests or navigational clearance applications, but I had never processed warp records at this volume or at this analytical level. The records showed warp activity across human-inhabited regions. They showed it across centuries, and what they showed, presented as numerical turbulence indices and categorical incursion frequency ratings, was that warp activity in regions of human habitation within this reconstructed galaxy was lower than any equivalent data I had encountered in Imperial records. Not absent. I want to be precise again. The warp was still active. The data showed incursion events. Daemon manifestations were recorded. Ships were lost to warp transit anomalies. None of these facts were absent from the record. The warp was still the warp, still the dimension of madness and predation that the Emperor's light strains to hold at bay. But the frequency was lower. The intensity indices were lower. The spontaneous manifestation rates were lower, and the records contained a correlation note, a statistical annotation appended to the data block that identified a negative correlation between the absence of mass-coordinated human suffering and a reduction in spontaneous demonic activity in surrounding warp space. I read this correlation note 4 times. The 4th time I held my notation rod without using it, which the servo skull may or may not have recorded as behavioral hesitation. I was not aware of the servo skull at that moment. I was aware only of the correlation note and what it was stating. The ecclesiarchy teaches that the Emperor's light shields humanity from the horrors of the warp, that without the Emperor's protective presence, focused through the Astronomicon and administered through the ritual practices of the Ministorum, humanity would be consumed by warp entities drawn to the psychic resonance of human emotion and human fear. This teaching is not merely theological in the Administratum's functional framework, it is operational fact. The warp is dangerous. The Emperor protects. The institutions that administer the Emperor's protection are therefore necessary instruments of survival. The correlation note was suggesting something different. It was not suggesting that the warp was harmless. It was suggesting that the primary psychic resonance feeding warp disturbance in areas of human habitation was not human emotion in general, but specifically the concentrated mass suffering produced by coordinated governance systems that systematically generate fear, pain, and spiritual anguish at planetary and segmentum scale. It was suggesting, in the dry numerical language of statistical correlation, that the Imperium's methods of protection might also be its primary mechanism for generating what it was protecting against. I closed the correlation note. I opened my notation log and entered Warp Activity Data Block Processed. Correlation Notation Present, filed as Statistical Modeling Artifact. Non-actionable at current processing level. The notation felt thin. It was thin, but it was what I had. I moved forward. The dataset accelerated after that. I do not know how else to describe what happened to my experience of processing that material across the hours that followed. A standard data parcel moves at a pace I control. I open a record, I process it. I file it, I open the next record. My processing speed is consistent, approximately 11 to 15 minutes per standard data parcel of medium complexity, slower for complex items, faster for routine ones. I have processed data for 16 years, and I know my own pace the way I know the temperature of the alcove at different times of the shift cycle. This dataset did not move at my pace. Or rather, I moved through it at my pace. But the material it presented seemed to compress and expand in ways that made the time feel different. I would spend 20 minutes on a single planetary record that demanded careful attention, and then the next 3 hours would pass while I processed what felt like decades of reconstructed history, vast spans of human civilization, developing and shifting and dying and persisting without any of the structures I had been trained to classify as markers of legitimate human existence. Ork infestations appeared in the data. Tyranid splinter fleet approaches. Necron awakening events recorded in isolated systems. And what the data showed, with blunt statistical honesty, was that unprotected human worlds were consumed by these threats, not uniformly, not immediately, but over the span of centuries, isolated human colonies facing Ork expansion without coordinated military response were, in the majority of recorded cases, eventually overcome. The mathematics of that were not subtle. One world, however innovative, however adaptive, cannot manufacture enough void-capable weapons to stop a warg that has had 2 centuries to grow. I felt something when I processed these records. I want to name it accurately. It was relief. A specific, functional relief, the kind that comes when data confirms a foundational assumption that the preceding data had been quietly eroding. The dataset had been showing me stable worlds, clean populations, reduced warp activity, all of it suggesting that imperial governance was not the only path to human survival. And then the Ork records appeared, and the Tyranid records appeared, and the data became familiar again, became correct, became the data I had been trained to expect from a galaxy without organized human defense. Without the Imperium, humanity dies, scattered, unrecorded, consumed in silence. I filed the threat records with a note that read, "External threat data confirms necessity of coordinated defense infrastructure. Cross-reference with standard Imperial military doctrine framework pending." But the dataset continued. After the threat records came a new set of planetary files, and these files described worlds that had survived the threats, not the same worlds that had been consumed, different ones. Worlds that had detected the approach of threats and responded through means that the dataset catalogued in a category I had to read 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. The category header read, "Adaptive, Non-Imperial Defensive Technologies." I processed these records with deliberate slowness. I was aware, at this stage, that something had been happening to my processing that I would need to describe correctly in any audit of my notation log. I needed the notation to reflect precise procedural engagement. I was a lex mechanic processing data. That was my function. If the data contained material that was counter-expectational, my function was to process it and file it correctly, not to refuse it or halt the shift. What the record showed was this: human enclaves in the reconstructed galaxy that had survived significant periods of xenos threat exposure had, in the absence of Mechanicus guidance and Imperial standardization, developed technological approaches to void warfare and planetary defense that did not match any entry in the Mechanicus standard template construct archive as I understood it. Not superior, necessarily, but different. Novel void shielding configurations. Energy dispersal systems with geometric principles, I did not recognize, and several records of human populations that had established what the dataset termed cooperative mutual defense arrangements with xenos species. I paused on this. A long pause, longer than any I had taken in the shift, long enough that if the servo skull was logging pause durations, it would have flagged this moment in my behavioral record. In the Imperium, xenos is a categorical designation that translates functionally as to be destroyed. There are 912 known xenos species in the Administratum's official threat classification registry. Of these, 0 are categorized as trustworthy. The Ordo Xenos exists to ensure that any human contact with xenos species beyond armed confrontation is treated as a potential contamination event and investigated accordingly. A human population that had established a cooperative arrangement with a xenos species would, in Imperial record, be flagged for immediate inquisitorial assessment and, in most cases, cleansed. The records showed 7 human enclaves that had established such arrangements and survived, long-term. Centuries of survival in regions of space that would, by standard Imperial threat modeling, have seen them wiped out within 2 generations. They had survived by not treating all xenos as identical threats, by making distinctions, by doing something the Administratum categorically does not permit. I classified these records as ideological deviation, non-applicable, filed under reconstructive modeling artifacts. And I told myself that was sufficient. I told myself the enclaves that had survived through deviation were statistical outliers, that the overall data still showed the majority of unprotected human worlds succumbing to threats, that the survival rate without the Imperium was categorically lower than the survival rate within it. This was true. I was not lying to myself. The survival rate without Imperial coordination was lower. More human worlds died without the Imperium than died within it, when measured against gross existence timelines. But I had begun to notice that the question I was answering was not the question the data was asking. The absence of the Astronomicon appeared in the dataset as a section header, and I opened it with what I can only describe as reluctance, a behavioral state I noted with discomfort, because reluctance implies anticipation of an unpleasant finding, which implies that by this stage of the processing shift, I was anticipating what the data would show before I saw it, which implies that the data had already generated sufficient pattern recognition material in my processing mind to allow prediction. I was processing the data, but the data was also doing something to me, building something. Installing something in the space where the dataset's information was being integrated with my existing framework of Imperial operational truth. The Astronomicon section was brief. It noted that warp transit in the reconstructed galaxy, without a Terra-based navigational beacon, was more dangerous and slower and more prone to deviation. Ships were lost at higher rates. Transit times between distant systems were measured in months or years rather than weeks. Navigational errors claimed lives that, in Imperial transit records, would have survived. The warp, without the Emperor's beacon to orient through it, was darker and more resistant to safe passage. I noted this. I filed it under Navigational Infrastructure Deficit Confirmed. Imperium provides essential transit capability. And then I read the subsequent note. The note observed that because warp transit was slower and more dangerous, trade and contact between human worlds in the reconstructed galaxy was reduced. Systems were more isolated from one another. The flow of resources between worlds was less efficient. And then, immediately following, the note stated that as a consequence of this reduced connectivity, no single event or system failure could cascade across all of human space simultaneously. There was no single point of failure. The loss of any one world, however significant, could not destroy humanity in total, because humanity in total was not dependent on any single world. There was no singular corpse sustaining the species. I know now that this was the sentence that went in and did not come back out in the same form. Because the Emperor, on the Golden Throne, is a corpse sustaining the species. That is not heresy to state, It is operational fact, acknowledged in the highest tiers of administratum cosmological record, the reason the throne exists, the reason it is maintained, the reason 10,000 psychers die each standard day to feed the beacon that keeps the warp navigable. The Emperor is dead, or as close to dead as a being of his magnitude can become, and his sustained death is the mechanism by which humanity survives. Remove the golden throne, remove the beacon, and the warp closes, and humanity cannot navigate between its worlds, and the species fractures. The single point of failure the dataset was describing was not a tactical weakness. It was the architecture of the Imperium itself. I stopped the processing sequence at this point. I did not halt the system. I did not log a formal stop action. I simply stopped reading for a period of time, my notation rod in my right hand, my gaze directed at the terminal surface, but not focusing on the text in front of me, my augmented respiratory systems, maintaining their standard rhythm, while something in the non-augmented parts of my mind worked through a sequence that I did not choose and could not stop. If the Imperium is the bulwark against annihilation, and the Imperium's existence creates a single point of failure that, if removed, would annihilate humanity, then the Imperium is also humanity's greatest existential vulnerability. Not only its greatest defender. I picked up my notation rod. I entered. Navigational deficit assessment complete. Proceeding to next section. I proceeded. The next several hours were the worst. Not in terms of distress. I want to be precise. I was not distressed in the way the ecclesiarchy defines distress as a spiritual state requiring pastoral intervention. I was not experiencing warp contact symptoms. I was not hearing voices or seeing manifestations. I was a functioning Lex mechanic processing a sanctioned dataset on a standard shift, and my biological and augmented systems were operating within normal parameters at all times. But the data was relentless. Cross-referencing. That was what I was doing, or what the dataset was structured to compel me to do. To look at one data block and then look at another, and then look at the space between them where the relationship lived. The planetary records, the warp activity logs, the threat assessment summaries, the adaptive survival records, the navigational deficit analysis. All of it sitting inside my notation log, individually filed and categorized and managed, and yet the act of looking from one to another was doing what individual filing could not prevent. Warp disturbance in the reconstructed galaxy was lower in regions without mass-coordinated human suffering. In the Imperium, mass-coordinated human suffering is not an unintended side effect. It is a system feature. Tithe extraction creates suffering. Industrial conscription creates suffering. Penal battalions create suffering. The ecclesiarchy's ritual practices, particularly the communal devotional hours with their imagery of judgment and divine wrath, and the smallness of human life before the Emperor's will, create suffering. Billions of people suffering in synchronized patterns across the entire galaxy, all of it psychically resonant, all of it feeding into the warp at a scale no individual world could generate. The Emperor's faithful creation of mass suffering to fuel the Astronomicon and sustain imperial control was also the single largest generator of psychic warp resonance in the galaxy. What the Imperium claimed to resist, it was also the primary mechanism of producing. I looked at this conclusion in my processing mind. The way one looks at a structural fault in a load-bearing column, you do not immediately flee. You stand and look at it, and try to determine whether what you are seeing is a fault or a shadow, whether the damage is real or an artifact of the light. I stood and looked at this conclusion for a long time in the space between one notation entry and the next. The conclusion was real, and then I took the next step, because the next step was what a Lex mechanic does when a conclusion appears, which is to test it against the prior framework. I asked myself, does this conclusion invalidate the Imperium's necessity? The answer was no. The Imperium is still the only structure capable of mounting coordinated defense against Ork expansion, Tyranid fleet incursion, chaos assault. The Imperium still protects more humans than it kills, measured by direct military threat. Without Imperial fleets, Without the Astartes, without the Guard and the Mechanicus, and the vast machinery of organized human military response, the species would lose far more ground to external threats than it loses to internal systemic pressures. The Imperium is necessary. I believed this. I still believe this. That is not the thing that broke. What broke, in the space of the next section of data, was the following. I had been treating the Imperium's necessity as proof of its design's correctness. If the Imperium is necessary, then what the Imperium does must be what is necessary. Its methods must be optimal, or at least the best available. Its costs must be unavoidable. If 10,000 psychers die each day to feed the Astronomicon, this must be because 10,000 psychers is the minimum required. If billions live in industrial servitude, this must be because their servitude is the most efficient configuration. If faith is administered through Terra, it must be because Terra is the most effective faith mechanism. But the dataset was not suggesting the Imperium was unnecessary. It was suggesting something more precise and more terrible than that. It was suggesting that the Imperium had been designed to be exactly what it is. Not because these were the minimum costs of human survival, but because these costs produced specific outputs, specific qualities of human psychic resonance, specific patterns of suffering and faith and fear that sustained the exact systems that required them. The Imperium sustains the conditions it claims to resist because those conditions are what it was built to produce. Humanity survives, but only as fuel. I did not move for some time after I arrived at this conclusion. I know I did not move because the servo skull descended from its station at the ceiling of my alcove and hovered at face level for approximately 8 seconds before returning to its position, which is a behavioral prompt. Servo skulls are programmed to physically approach a lex mechanic who remains fully motionless for more than 90 seconds. As prolonged motionlessness can indicate medical crisis. My motionlessness had triggered the prompt. I moved. I picked up my notation rod. I entered text. I do not remember precisely what text I entered at that moment, but it was something standard, some procedural notation. And then I kept going, because stopping was not a thing I could do. The changes to my experience of the vault were subtle at first. I became aware of the servo skull in a way I had not been before. Not as a standard monitoring presence, which I had lived alongside for 16 years without it constituting a felt pressure, but as an eye, a record. I was aware that everything I did at my terminal was being logged, had always been logged, would always be logged, and that this logging was not neutral observation but active surveillance with specific interests. Whatever I was processing was known. My progress through the dataset was being watched in real time, as the directive from the higher node had already demonstrated. The silence of the vault, which is not truly silent, the fans cycling, the low hum of processing warmth, the distant sound of other alcoves operating at their own rhythms, that silence began to feel different. Not threatening, more absolute. The kind of silence that contains everything already decided. I scanned the processing queue for the dataset's next section. The section was labeled Long-Term Divergent Survival Patterns. The subsection beneath it read, Cross-Timeline Analysis, Civilizational Centralization as Risk Multiplier. This section was the convergence. Thousands of reconstructed timelines. The dataset contained not one alternative history but a dense lattice of them, variations in starting conditions and environmental factors and resource distributions and first contact scenarios, each variation threading out across centuries of simulated or reconstructed historical development. And across all of them, the dataset's analytical engine had identified patterns. In timelines where human civilizations formed centralized empires, where singular governing structures administered large populations, where belief and obedience were systematized and enforced at scale, warp activity in the surrounding region increased. The increase was not immediate. It was slow, accumulating over centuries as the governing structure embedded itself deeper into daily life, as the psychic resonance of millions of humans trained to feel specific emotions in specific synchronized patterns in response to specific symbolic triggers began to register in the warp as coherent signal rather than noise. The more structured the suffering, the cleaner the signal. The cleaner the signal, the stronger the warp resonance. In timelines where human civilizations remained fragmented, where no single empire administered large populations, where suffering existed but was chaotic and distributed and unpatterned, warp activity remained elevated in absolute terms, but never peaked into the organized eruption events that characterized the centralized timeline histories. Daemonic incursions occurred, but not great crusades, not galaxy-spanning demonic ascendancy events. The warp remained turbulent but did not organize itself into the coherent assault patterns associated with the ruinous power's major manifestations. I read this slowly. I read it the way you read something that changes the category of everything it touches, not an addition of information. A reframing. A context shift that makes prior information mean something different from what it meant before. The Chaos Gods feed on human psychic resonance. This is doctrine. The four powers are sustained by specific emotional registers: desire, despair, excess, stagnation, drawn from the warp expressions of human feeling. The Imperium teaches that the correct response to this is the suppression of those emotions through faith and discipline and devotion, the channeling of human psychic output into worship of the Emperor, rather than into the raw emotional states that feed the ruinous powers. But what the dataset was showing was that the Imperium's faith administration system, which systematically generates fear of judgment, despair at mortality, anguish at separation from the divine, and the specific ecstatic terror of collective devotional ritual, was producing a psychic signal that fed the same powers it was designed to resist. Not because the ecclesiarchy intended this, not because it was a conspiracy, but because systematic mass suffering, organized into coherent emotional patterns, is exactly the most efficient possible warp fuel, regardless of what symbols are inscribed on the vessels performing the ritual. The Imperium is the most efficient psychic engine of warp resonance ever constructed by organic life in this galaxy. That is not a flaw. That is what it was built to do. I sat with this for a long time. I cannot tell you precisely how long because I was not tracking time at this point in my shift. I know the shift started at 0400. I know at some point it became 0900 and then 1300, and my relief was due at 1600. But within those hours, time had become irregular in a way I lack precise notation for. The knowledge was complete. It had assembled itself. Not through a single revelation, but through accumulation, through the procedural act of processing a dataset that had been constructed with the specific architecture of leading a careful processor to a specific conclusion through a sequence of individually manageable steps. I understood, in that moment, what the dataset was. It was not merely a reconstruction. It was not merely an academic exercise. It was a record of what the galaxy could be, had been in some divergent origin, and it had been constructed or preserved or both with the intent that someone like me would sit in a vault like this and process it section by section and arrive at the conclusion I had arrived at. And then I understood the second thing. Somewhere above me, someone already knew I was arriving at this conclusion, had known I would, had watched others arrive at it before me. The higher node directive, the self-validating authorization, the absence of authentication chains, the careful sequencing of the dataset's contents. This was not a mistake. This was a process. I was inside a process that had happened before and would happen again. Not a trap, not a punishment, a protocol. I had become an entry in a repeating sequence. I sat very still at my terminal and waited for whatever came next. The man who arrived at the entrance to my alcove wore the red robes of the upper administratum, not the Inquisition, not the Adeptus Arbites, not any enforcement body. The red of senior administrative function, the mark of the doctrinal oversight tier, The kind of official whose presence in a data vault sublevel was unusual but not unprecedented. The kind of official who appeared when procedure needed to be enforced without the weight of prosecution attached. He was accompanied by one servitor carrying a portable documentation unit. The servitor stood beside the entrance to my alcove and made no sound. The man in red robes walked to the secondary chair beside my processing station, the one reserved for supervisory review visits, and sat down. He did not speak immediately. He reviewed something on a small data slate he carried. The servo skull above my alcove had stilled itself. I do not know what that meant in terms of its recording function. The man looked up at me. His face was unremarkable. The face of someone who has administered procedures many times and has no particular feeling about any individual instance. He said, "Your processing record for today's shift has been reviewed at the oversight level and found to be in full compliance with standard Lex Mechanic operational protocol. You are commended for correct procedural engagement." I said, "Thank you." I said nothing else. He said, "Dataset Theta 9 Upsilon 7 Dark has been designated for reclassification under the category of non-permissible counterfactual cognition. This classification does not indicate heresy. It indicates that the material within the dataset falls outside the range of information that contributes to productive processing function." I understood the distinction he was making, and I understood that the distinction was important to him or to whatever function he was serving. Not heresy. Heresy implies wrongness. Non-permissible implies simply not for you, not for anyone at this level, perhaps not for anyone. He said, "Your completion of the dataset processing cycle has been noted. You are requested to submit to a standard mnemonic audit to ensure that the processing material has not created cataloging conflicts within your primary data storage architecture. The audit is a maintenance procedure. It does not reflect any finding of deviation or misconduct." I said, "I understand." He said, "The audit will be conducted here, in your alcove, by the servitor. It will take approximately 40 minutes. You will remain conscious throughout. When it is complete, you will be reassigned to a standard processing queue. Your shift record will show no interruption." I said, "I understand." He stood. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. I think he was looking for something. I do not know whether he found it. He said, "Your service to the administratum and the Emperor is valued. This work is necessary." I said, "The Emperor protects." He nodded once and moved to the alcove entrance. The servitor moved to my station. I turned to face the processing interface and placed my hands in the induction cradle. The 40 minutes that followed are the part I remember least precisely. This is accurate to say because I remember remembering them. But the memories themselves are indistinct, and I know that this indistinction is not a natural feature of how I remember things. My recall is augmented. My memory architecture retains information with considerably more accuracy than standard biological cognition. Events I was present for, I remember clearly. The 40 minutes of the audit, I remember as through a diffusion filter, shapes and sensations, but no sharp details. I remember the touch of the servitor's instruments at my cranial augmentation ports. I remember a sequence of sensations that I do not have precise vocabulary for, a kind of interior unraveling and rethreading, as if information within my storage architecture was being examined one thread at a time, and certain threads were being reattached in configurations that differed from their original state. I remember at one point being asked, by the servitor or by some process the servitor was administering, to try to recall the most significant processing event of the preceding shift. I recall having a strong drive to comply with this request. I recall also a sensation that I can only describe as a door closing, not being blocked, not being locked, but definitively closing, in the interior space where the information I had been processing lived. The door closed. The information was still present. I could feel it the way you feel a room in a building you are standing outside of. You know the room is there. You know it contains things. You cannot enter it. When the 40 minutes ended, the servitor withdrew. The man in red robes was no longer present. I do not know when he had left. My shift record showed, as he had promised, no interruption. The notation log I had maintained throughout the processing shift was intact, all my entries present, but the notation log had been altered in a way I noticed only gradually, in the days following. The entries were all there. The individual notations were all there, but the entries had been resequenced in a way that removed their connectivity. They were present as isolated records rather than as a chain. Anyone reading my notation log from that shift would see a series of procedural entries for various dataset items, each appropriately noted, none clearly connected to any other. The chain that had built the conclusion was gone from the notation log. The conclusion itself was gone from my accessible memory. What remained was the shape. My position was reassigned to Archive Cluster 7 on Sublevel 11, 3 levels above where I had been working. This is a lateral reassignment in formal terms. The Archive Cluster 7 processes historical census data for the Obscurus segmentum going back to M32, routine material, categorically straightforward, the kind of work assigned to Lex mechanics in the later stages of their service careers when sustained analytical focus becomes less reliable. I am 51 years old in standard terms. The reassignment was consistent with my career stage. I reported to my new alcove on the shift following the audit. I performed the activation litany. I placed my hands in the induction cradle. The machine accepted my biometric signature. The alcove filled with amber processing warmth. A servo skull above the new alcove noted my arrival. The processing queue contained 31 items. Standard census data, mortality ledgers, compliance confirmations. I processed them in order. 11 minutes per item on average, slightly faster for the simpler ones. The work was familiar, the cadence was familiar. By the fourth item in the queue, I had achieved what I can only call functional absorption, the state in which processing becomes automatic and the mind occupies only as much attention as the task requires, the remainder settling into the particular quiet that a Lex Mechanic's mind develops over years of repetitive classification work. I believe in the Emperor. I believe in the necessity of the Imperium. I hold these beliefs with the fullness available to me. But on the sixth day of work in Archive Cluster 7, a census file came through my queue from a world I recognized, or thought I recognized. A coordinate reference that registered in my processing mind as familiar without generating a specific prior record to match it. I processed the file. The world had a stable population. It had tithe compliance records. It had ecclesiarchy affiliation markers. It was a fully imperial world in every documented category. And yet when I closed the file, something felt incomplete, as though the file had contained additional data that I had not processed. I checked the file size against the processing record. The file size matched. I had processed everything the file contained. The incompleteness was not in the file. On the 9th day, I processed a mortality ledger. The ledger recorded 14,000 deaths from a combination of industrial accident and toxic atmospheric event on a manufacturing world. The deaths were categorized as acceptable operational loss, exactly as such deaths are always categorized. I filed the ledger correctly, but after I filed it, I sat for a moment with the casualty figure in my processing mind, not in distress, not questioning the categorization, but examining the number in a way I could not precisely describe, as though the number were a symbol whose referent I was attempting to recall. 14,000 deaths, categorized as acceptable operational loss. The word acceptable passed through me like a frequency I could almost tune to, almost but not quite. There was something on the other side of the word acceptable that I could not reach. On the 14th day, I processed a series of population projections for 3 worlds in the mid-Obscurus zone. The projections showed expected population growth, expected tithe output, expected devotional compliance maintenance. Standard material. I processed all 3 without incident. But when I reviewed my notation entries for those 3 projections, I noticed that I had, on 2 of them, automatically typed the word stable before entering the official processing category. as though stable were a prior category that my annotation instinct was reaching for before the correct imperial schema overrode it. I deleted the word stable from both entries. I entered the correct categories. I filed the projections. I did not question why my notation instinct had reached for a category that was not in the processing schema. I noticed it. I corrected it. I moved on. This is correct behavior. This is how a lex mechanic maintains operational integrity when an anomaly appears in their own processing. You note it, you correct it, you move forward. The system functions because individuals within it maintain their functions without allowing anomalies to compound. I know the Imperium is necessary. I know it as an operational fact. I know it the way I know that without the Astronomicon ships are lost, that without guard regiments, xenos advances are not contained, that without the Administratum's tithe systems, the war machine does not receive its materiel. These are not articles of faith. They are structural realities. The architecture of the galaxy as it is. You do not dispute architecture by wishing it were different. You operate within the architecture and you perform your function, and the species continues. There was a silence where something once was. I know this the way I know about rooms I cannot enter. There is a shape to the silence, not the absence of information. Information I have never had is simply absent. This is different. This silence has a form to it. The form of a space where something was organized, where connections between things had been built and then had the building removed while the things remained, like scattered components of a machine whose assembly sequence has been erased from the manual. I cannot reconstruct it. The audit was thorough. Whatever pathways enabled the assembly have been redirected, and the redirection is complete enough that I cannot locate the original routing. I cannot even, with precision, identify what I am failing to reconstruct. I know that the processing shift on sub-level 14, on the night shift of the date I have log confirmed, produced processing output that was significant. I know that the significance was of a kind that required administrative attention. I know that the administrative attention was applied and produced the standard outcome. I know that I served correctly and was corrected correctly and am now serving correctly again. I process my cue. I recite the catechisms. The servo skull watches me with habitual precision. My notation log is clean. My performance metrics have not been impacted. The reassignment to Archive Cluster 7 is not punitive. The work here is important in the long-term preservation sense. The census records of M32 are irreplaceable in their original form, and the lex mechanics who maintain them are performing a function without which continuity would be compromised. I continue. There are days when the silence is louder than other days, not painful, not destabilizing, simply more present. The days when casualty figures appear in ledgers without the number feeling like only a number. The days when a compliance record produces that brief sensation of incompleteness, of a file containing less than it should. The days when I type a word before the correct word and have to delete it. These are small things, anomalies within standard operational variants. I note them and correct them and do not escalate them because they do not meet the threshold of actionable deviation. A lex mechanic who escalated every minor cognitive anomaly would be a burden on the oversight apparatus. My function is to process efficiently and to maintain my notation log correctly and to serve the Emperor's design within the capacity assigned to me. I do these things. Somewhere in the structure of this vault, in the sealed sections I do not have clearance to access, the dataset I processed on sub-level 14 still exists. It was not deleted. The man in the red robes told me it was classified, not destroyed, preserved, but inaccessible. Sealed within the architecture of this building, the way the knowledge that was once in my accessible memory is sealed within the architecture of me. The dataset exists. I know.